Well, President Obama leaves for an official trip to Saudi Arabia tomorrow, and it's not clear that he's going to get the warmest welcome. The Middle East superpower and close U.S. ally is threatening to sell off tens of billions of dollars in American assets if the U.S. Congress passes a new bipartisan law that would allow victims of 9/11 and other terror attacks to sue foreign governments, including Saudi Arabia's. The White House said today the president will not sign that bill as it stands, but will President Obama release 28 classified pages of the 9/11 Commission report that could indicate Saudi royal family ties to the worst terror attack ever on the U.S.? I want to bring in David Axelrod now. He's CNN's senior political commentator. He's also the host of the podcast, The Axe Files. It's great. You should listen to it. In the latest episode, you spoke with Ben Rhodes. He's, of course, the president's deputy national security advisor for strategic communications. And he spoke about possible Saudi knowledge of 9/11. Here's a brief clip from the interview.
It's not that it was Saudi government policy to support al-Qaeda, but there were a number of very wealthy individuals in Saudi Arabia who would contribute, sometimes directly, to extremist groups, sometimes to charities that were kind of ended up being ways to launder money to these groups. So a lot of the funding, and bin Laden himself was a wealthy Saudi.
So, David, listening to that and other comments that Rhodes made here, I mean, later in the interview, he said that there was at least a lack of attention to this kind of money going to groups such as al-Qaeda. So if it was not explicitly Saudi government policy supporting al-Qaeda and 9/11, was he saying or implying that someone in or tied to the Saudi royal family knew about 9/11? Or if not 9/11 specifically, was directly supporting al-Qaeda in advance of 9/11?
Well, he did leave that door open. He talked about how far-flung the royal family was and left open the possibility that there were members of the royal family that were among those who were funneling monies to extremist groups. And yes, it was very, very clear. And remember, Ben Rhodes is interesting here, not just because he's been working with the president on national security for the last 9 years, dating back to the campaign, but he also was a staffer on the 9/11 Commission and helped write the 9/11 report that has come back into question now because of some pages that are not public that relate directly to this issue. So he was talking around that a little bit, but clearly gave the sense that there were people around the Saudis, around the influential circles there, who may have been involved. And I asked him, have there been blunt conversations about this? And he said, we've had very blunt conversations with them. And he made the point that the Saudis now see these extremist groups as threats to them. And so they've become partners in counterterrorism, which they weren't back in the period before 9/11.
That's right. They had to set their sights on Saudi Arabia before they really took action. Now there's this legislation before Congress that would allow families of 9/11 victims to sue foreign governments, including Saudi Arabia, for attacks that killed Americans on American soil. We've seen on the campaign trail that both Senator Sanders and Senator Clinton have expressed support for this legislation. Is this a law that the president is likely to sign, assuming it gets through both houses of Congress?
He's indicated his opposition to it, and the Saudis have been very tough in speaking about how they might react in terms of unloading American treasuries and some other steps they might take. So this is one of those uncomfortable areas that you cover this beat, Jim. So this is one of those uncomfortable areas where our national security interests may not align with what makes sense to the broad number of Americans. And in the midst of a political campaign, that becomes even more fraught. But I would think the president would think long and hard about that.
All right, on to domestic politics. Of course, we have the pivotal New York primary coming up on Tuesday. And I have to ask you, with your background, you've been in a campaign or two before, what's your prediction on the Democratic side and the Republican side?
This one doesn't seem all that mysterious. If you look at the aggregation of polling, and there's been a lot of polling in both in both the Democratic and Republican primaries. Hillary Clinton seems to have a double-digit lead over Bernie Sanders, and there's no sense of that diminishing going into the final day of the campaign. And Donald Trump seems to be running away with the Republican primary, which is meaningful because if he gets over 50% of the vote under the rules that are established in New York, he could walk away with all or most of those delegates, which would put him back on track to get the majority that he needs, or potentially get the majority he needs to win on the first ballot. My view is if Donald Trump doesn't win on the first ballot, he's not going to be the nominee of the party. So this is very consequential.
No question. David Axelrod, thanks very much.